Okay, so today I'm going to be looking at two articles, both consider metaphors and how they are comprehended. My name is Josh, or Joshua by the way. And I'm also going to be looking at the idea that bodily experiences are the basis of formation for metaphorical language and thought. And there was also a common theme of food, in that the first study looks at hunger and the second one looks at taste metaphors. So just a little bit of background and definitions. So figurative language consists of expressions with different meanings to their literal interpretations. And the metaphors are a type of figurative language which compare things without using the words like or as. And in particular, the research today looks at conventional metaphors, which are more very common metaphors, and we often don't notice that we're using conventional metaphors or hearing conventional metaphors when we come across them. For example, look how far we've come. It's been a long, bumpy road, which is an example of a conventional metaphor. It describes maybe a relationship and sees love as a journey. But when we're approached with a metaphor like this, we don't often realise that it's metaphorical language. So, first study is by Gibbs, Lima and Francoso. Metaphor is grounded in embodied experience. And I've got a picture of the almonds here because they briefly analysed poetry by Chilean poet Pablo Neruda, who one of his lines in his love poems was, "I want to eat your skin like a whole almond." And the researchers describe this as a vitally metaphorical way of thinking, which I thought was a really good quote, because the feeling could not really be expressed in any other way. If it was expressed literally, it just wouldn't have the same effect on us, and it wouldn't be able to express the feeling of the poet in the same way either. So the purpose was to explore the connection between physical bodily experiences and metaphors, and also to find patterns in how people use metaphors, especially within the theme of hunger. And so they carried out a review of empirical evidence before carrying out a case study themselves. So what did they find in their review? It is thought that the traditional belief of metaphor transcends human experience, so that it reflects metaphysical truths, things that aren't real, that are above anything that we can experience as humans. However, cognitive science has contradicted that finding and shown that metaphor is actually grounded in embodied experiences. It is the real experiences that give rise to metaphors. So there are three key points that the authors make regarding metaphor use in thought and language. The first is that metaphor use goes beyond just a linguistic device for literary effect. Instead, it is a fundamental part of people's ordinary thought, the way they think, the way they speak. The second point makes a distinction between dead metaphors and conventional metaphors, which scholars have often used interchangeably, but the authors clearly state that there is a difference between the two. A dead metaphor has an opaque meaning, and a conventional metaphor has an enduring conceptual mapping. So an example of this would be, "He kicked the bucket." This has an opaque meaning because we don't know where it comes from. There are actually theories. Does anyone have any ideas where this comes from? I looked it up. There's a lot of theories to do with it. I think the main one is to do with someone hanging themselves and kicking the bucket from underneath them so they can achieve this act successfully. But there's about 3 other theories. So basically, when you see this, you don't know the actual meaning, so it's therefore dead. It's opaque. And then the one that I mentioned before is conventional, because we know where it comes from. And the third point is that metaphors, at least partly, arise from repeated bodily experiences. So love is a journey, which would describe, let's go back for a second, love is a journey is a conceptual metaphor that would give rise to these metaphorical expressions. And this is thought to actually arise from repeated bodily movements from one place to another, that then gives us this understanding and applies that information from the source domain, which is moving between place to place, to the target domain, which is love, which ends with the metaphor love is a journey. But we'll look at the mechanisms for that now. So image schema are cognitive structures that represent the actions of the body and perceptual interactions of the body within an environment, including manipulation of objects. They emerge during sensory motor activity, so doing things, interacting with the environment, using objects, and consist of dynamic spatial patterns. And it's actually thought that most of human cognition occurs in the image schema rather than sententially, so using verbal sentences. So, if image schema arise from bodily experiences, how might image schema affect our interpretation of metaphors? The authors use the idea of momentum and our understanding of it and the physics of it to suggest that bodily experiences of momentum help extract meaning from metaphorical expressions. So, how might we experience momentum? Can anyone say how we might see momentum? Or how we might feel it, or how we might hear it? Yep.
A lot of times I visualize it as something rolling, I guess.
Okay, yeah.
Speed.
So that will come from from seeing a physical object. Yeah.
I feel like in a car or something you can like feel.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can see it in objects, we can feel it kinesthetically in, say, a moving car, maybe a roller coaster. We could arguably we can hear it as well. So one example is the hearing the crescendo of thunder. So it builds up, and then you hear the big crescendo of the thunder, and then it dies down again. So that would be an example of audible momentum. So basically, we experience momentum repeatedly. Is therefore a recurring bodily experience. And so in these examples, we can actually see how this repeated bodily experience turns into metaphorical expression. So I was bowled over by that idea will come from things like seeing an object moving and bowling over the other object. And then we have too much momentum to withdraw from the election race, and maybe a sports coach might say we need some wins to build momentum, which I don't know how much truth in that, but I hear it quite a lot. Okay, so what mechanisms exist to try and explain how image schema influence metaphorical thought? So Lakoff and Johnson came up with the idea of conceptual metaphors, which are these things in capital letters here. Love is a journey, theories are buildings, and ideas are objects. So these are overarching systems from which many metaphors can be created within it. Interestingly, that is actually a high correspondence in the physics of an image schema and how language is understood. For the example, I was bowled over by that idea. Having seen, when someone is given a sentence, they make inferences about the idea being a big object, being an important, so it's a big important idea because they see big objects bowling over the small objects without stopping. And this theory has come from representational momentum studies, such as one by Freyd and Fink in 1984, who showed shapes on a screen. They were either rotating in one direction or moving in one direction. It would then disappear from view, and the participant would have to guess where it was, where it left the screen. And almost all cases show that the participants overestimate where it actually was, so it moves further in a direction because people have this image schema of momentum. The momentum moves it across. They just picture the shape continuing moving across the screen. However, there are issues with conceptual metaphor theory. So take the conceptual metaphor theories are buildings. So as in a theory can be constructed, a theory can be deconstructed, it can be built, it can have support just like a building can. So why can't a theory have windows? Why is this not a valid metaphor? So it's not an accepted thing that theories have windows, and conceptual metaphor theory doesn't explain why this isn't the case. So Grady in 1997 suggested that conceptual metaphors are not the most basic form of metaphorical mapping in human thought. In fact, primary metaphors are, and this will help explain why theories don't have windows. So when you start off with the conceptual metaphor theories of buildings, theories would need windows because theories should have everything that buildings have. Whereas when you start off with primary metaphors, so persisting is remaining erect, structure is physical structure, interrelated is interwoven, these together, these three primary metaphors can form the conceptual metaphor theories of buildings. And And then if you're to take, for example, just these two, structure is physical structure and interrelated is interwoven, you can come up with the conceptual metaphor, theories are fabrics, which can give rise to such inferences as theories can unravel, theories can be woven together, and theories can be colourful just as you can have a colourful fabric. So starting from the most basic building block of primary metaphors, it leaves no holes in the argument when you have this conceptual metaphor of one thing is another. So now for the case study, the authors made the observation that people's understanding of hunger gets mapped onto the understanding of the abstract concept of desire. So hunger is the source domain here, and the target domain is desire. So people have understanding of how hunger works, and then they apply this to desire. So first they performed a very brief analysis on some writing by 2 participants, which I'll take you through now. And then they performed 2 experiments. The first study looked at how a physical feeling of hunger is understood, and then the second aimed to find out how much this knowledge of hunger correlates with the abstract understanding of desire. So this is Nathan. He talks about his desire for video games, and when he was younger, all he could think about was video games. And he said he would get this craving in the pit of his stomach, where he just had to have a new game. And video games were his main source of mental fuel. But when he grew older, he said he'd had his fill. He no longer desired video games as much as he did before. And the second example they analysed was from Margot, who talked about her high school crush. And she said that she felt starved for his attention. She felt silly and empty because she wanted him so bad, and she wanted to eat him alive. He was yummy. So here you can see examples. The 2 participants understand how hunger feels, and then they use this understanding to describe their desires. This takes us into the first study. So there are 43 participants. They're all students, 20 from the University of California, and 23 from the University of Campinas in Brazil. And they were provided with a list of symptoms that may occur from hunger. And then they had to rate these symptoms in terms of whether they had experienced this symptom or not. So 1 would be they never felt this symptom, and 7 would be they feel this symptom quite frequently. So this is just some examples of the options that were given. So you had local, global, and behavioural symptoms. So local symptom would be the stomach grumbles, or the mouth waters, or the knees swell, and you can kind of guess what would get high ratings. So the stomach grumbles we would quite readily associate with hunger, whereas the knee swell is much less likely, so it would get a lower rating. So results of the first study, overall there's a high correlation between the 2 sets of students, which indicated to the researchers that there's a high regularity of perceived feelings of hunger, and embodied experiences of hunger seem to be shared across 2 cultures, although it is a very small sample size, so very restricted generalizability. There were a few differences though, so these are some of the examples that were more highly rated in English speakers compared to Portuguese speakers, and then vice versa here. So the mouth becomes dry, 1 becomes crazy about food, and 1 behaves madly and would do anything for food. These were highly rated in the Brazilian students, but in the American students these are more highly rated, so the whole body aches, 1 gets annoyed, and 1 becomes depressed. Does anyone want to speculate why these differences might exist? And you can really speculate. The authors were very speculative in their thoughts about this. Or are there any patterns between the 2?
I don't know, I just see patterns, like the English, they get like really mad, and then Portuguese, they just get really like crazy.
Okay, so this is more an emotional getting annoyed, whereas this is kind of going crazy.
Yeah.
So that's actually one of the differences that they picked out, so the severity of it. So they suggested that the Brazilians had more severe symptoms associated with hunger compared to the Americans, which they speculated maybe hunger is more salient in Brazil than America, but again, very, very speculative. and doesn't really mean much, but kind of gives you insight into why the differences might be there. The second study used participants from the same populations, but they used 25 students now from each university. They were asked, so they were given 2 sets of questions. They were asked how they felt when experiencing certain feelings, love, lust, and desire for things such as fame, adventure, money. And then they were given options such as becoming weak, becoming dizzy, getting annoyed. And they were asked to rate these as how much they, from again 1 to 7, if they felt it strongly, if they felt it weakly. So half the options were, for each question, were constructed from highly rated responses in the first study, and the other half were lowly rated responses from the first study. And the second set of questions asked how acceptable the participants thought the feeling would be to express in these linguistic terms. 1, unacceptable, 7, highly acceptable. So table 1 shows the results. So you've got a high number. So when you've got a high number in strong compared to weak, that will show a high correlation. So people agreed that it's acceptable to express it in these ways. And just remember that the strong ones were previously rated as high in the first study. So actually in all of them, the strong number is higher than the weak number, and all of these differences were significant except these 2. So I don't know why they all do it like this, but in English-speaking students, the strong and weak responses for other, so desiring fame, desiring adventure, depending on what the question was, wasn't significant. But it kind of, actually I'll just conclude from that. So this led them to conclude that this study provides preliminary evidence that metaphors are grounded in a lived experience, and also that significant aspects of non-linguistic experience tie into people's understanding of metaphors. They also found, as you saw in the study 1 and study 2, a high regularity of metaphorical expressions in terms of desire in terms of hunger, even across the 2 cultures, and that primitive or primary metaphors are the most fundamental grounding for creating metaphors. There's obviously some limitations, very speculative analysis, and it's often the discussion is often more philosophical than it is scientific. However, they do acknowledge this, and it is meant to serve as preliminary evidence for further study rather than conclusive evidence in itself. On a few occasions, though, in the article, evidence provided is very vague, and they pick out random metaphors to serve a particular purpose to support an argument. But there's no way of knowing if this metaphor is representative or if it is out of the ordinary. And then finally, metaphorical expressions were subjectively rated by participants, and this was used as a basis for the second study. So you've got correlational evidence, you've got subjective ratings, so it's very hard to generalize. But again, this is preliminary evidence rather than the authors acknowledge this is not conclusive in itself. However, I do think that the philosophical discussion is very unique or is not readily seen in psychology articles. And I think the anecdotal evidence makes you think much more open-mindedly about metaphorical language. And so it serves as a very useful basis for future research, especially in looking at the connection between physical experiences and metaphorical expressions. Another strength of it is that this philosophical style helps relate cognitive psychology findings not only to the real world but also to function. So it explores the function and purpose, the meaning and purpose of metaphors rather than just simple responses to them and how we respond to them. So the review of evidence does actually lead them to make one strong claim, and that is that embodied experience motivates metaphorical language. but further empirical research is needed, which is where the next article comes in. But I'll finish it there and take questions before going on to the next one. Yep.
Why do you think it was the other was insignificant compared to the love and the loss?
I think that the way they collected the statistics, they were bound to converge because they have between 1 and 7, and so the first study, as it averages out, it became maybe 2 was a normal rating for low and 5 was a normal rating for high, and then they again used these ratings in the next one, and so I think it's just bound to converge. So I think it's really hard to say why it's hard to say that these have a stronger correlation than the others because of the way that data was collected. Yeah. Any other thoughts before we go on to the next one? Cool. Okay, so this goes on to takes us on to the next study, which is by Sitchin and Goldberg, and metaphorical sentences are more emotionally metaphorical sentences are more emotionally engaging than their literal counterparts. So this study examined what differences exist between processing of conventional metaphors and processing of their literal counterparts. So, for example, can the processing of the sentence "she received a sweet compliment" be distinguished from "she received a kind compliment"? So the sweet version of the sentence would be the metaphorical sentence, and the kind version would be the literal sentence, the literal counterpart. And the research actually used sentences just like this to in their brain imaging study. And the second aim was to find out if conventional metaphors are grounded in embodied representations, just as we discussed before. So even though we may encounter the conventional metaphor kindness is sweetness, which is the conceptual metaphor for here, we may encounter this every day, but does it still activate areas of the brain related to taste? So, we've got a lot of brain areas here, and this is just previous findings, and across the studies, a frontotemporal network has been activated more strongly for metaphors than literal processing. So we've got the inferior frontal gyri, which supports integration of verbal material and word knowledge into meaningful sentences. You've got the superior temporal gyri, which interprets sentence meaning. You've got the left middle temporal gyri, which is considered the seat of our conceptual representations. We've got the middle frontal gyrus. I will go through this in an image in a second. Middle frontal gyrus, which contributes to perspective taking and building theory of mind. You've got the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which subserves attention and working memory processes. And then you've got the left inferior temporal gyrus, which is supports written word recognition. So you can see on the diagrams here, you've got the inferior temporal gyri in the location indicated by 1. You've then got the superior temporal gyri at 2, up there, purple section. You then got so basically got integration of verbal material here. You've got interpretation of sentences up there at 2. At 3, it's called the seat of our conceptual representation, termed by Buchheimer, which is at 3 in the middle temporal gyri, middle frontal gyri, and then you've got the 4 and 5. You've got the middle frontal gyri, which is where the dorsomedial prefrontal cortex is. And then you've got the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex in a similar area. And then you've got the left inferior temporal gyrus, which is at 6, which is just underneath. So basically, all those areas, in simple terms, all of those areas have been shown to be active in processing metaphors, thereby showing metaphors require more cognitive resources than literal language. Novelty has been shown to be a mediator. So a more novel metaphor such as "he's spicy," which we don't come across every day, would require more processing than both literal sentences and conventional metaphorical sentences. But the researchers did factor novelty out in the research. Furthermore, conventional metaphors are actually processed just as quickly as literal language, so they don't expect to see any differences in processing time. And there are also different processing strategies that we use when approached with a metaphor. So judgments need to be made about plausibility, semantic relatedness with the target word, and naturalness of a metaphor in a particular context. So if we encounter a metaphor in an unnatural context, it often requires more integrative processes to make sense of it. And then just two more previous findings that I'm going to go over, which contribute directly to the hypotheses which are coming up. So you've got Dezay in 2011, control for familiarity and processing difficulty, and found more activation of left temporal areas. However, no involvement of the inferior frontal gyrus, as previously suggested. So this is unlikely to be involved in Citrin and Goldberg's study, as they controlled for these same variables. And then you've got Lacey and colleagues compared texture metaphors with literal sentence processing, and they found activation for texture-related areas in the brain. So a similar idea is here in that the taste metaphors are expected to activate gustatory areas in the brain, which are shown here. Just three key parts of the primary and secondary gustatory areas here. So you got the lateral orbitary frontal cortex. Which is here, which is on the inferior surface of the frontal lobe. You've got the frontal operculum, which is just up here, and then you've got the anterior insula, which is just inside, really prior up in the lateral sulcus. So there's two hypotheses. The first was exploratory, and it asked if additional areas are active for the processing of conventional metaphors. And if the answer to this question is yes, then we can conclude that distinct processing occurs for metaphorical sentences compared to literal sentences. And then the second hypothesis is that comprehension of taste metaphors will activate primary and secondary gustatory areas. So this includes the orbitofrontal cortex, the frontal operculum, and the anterior insula. Oh, and one potential problem with this is that the same areas may be active from processing a metaphor and not the taste. So to isolate these effects, they presented the taste referential words that you see in the sentences, such as sweet, by itself, and then scanned the brains to see the activity to compare it. So the neutral focus word shouldn't elicit the same activation. Methods. So the participants consisted of 26 native German speakers from Berlin, 19 female, 7 male with a mean of 27 years. All right-handed, all had normal vision or normal corrected vision. None had learning disabilities or neurological diseases. They then had 37 sentences that were constructed with conventional taste metaphors, and then they replaced single words to form the literal counterparts, and there are 37 of these as well. They then had an independent group which rated the sentences for these variables, so metaphoricity, taste reference, emotional valence, emotional arousal, imageability, and familiarity. So metaphorical sentences scored higher in metaphoricity and taste reference. They scored equal for the same besides familiarity. I think the researchers had hoped that familiarity would be at a similar level, but as it was, metaphorical sentences were slightly less familiar than literal sentences, so they used this as a regressor in the analyses. You then got these things, which are hash mark strings, which were created and interspersed with the critical items. And then you've got 8 filler sentences with comprehension questions. So you've got these to just get a baseline level of brain activity. You've got the filler sentences with comprehension questions to ensure that the participants are actually paying attention and understanding. And that was just followed by a yes or no response. And then you've got 4 filler sentences for the start of each run. And then they isolated out 26 taste referential words and 29 non-taste words to show in isolation. So participants were told to read for comprehension, responding yes or no. and the sentences were presented in 2 separate runs lasting 7 minutes each. During this time, structural image scans were acquired of the participant's brain. And you had sentences, each run consisted of half of each variable, so the metaphorical sentences, literal sentences, and the hash mark strings in a randomized order. And the sentences were presented for 4 seconds with 6 seconds for the questions following the filler sentences. And then there was a third run where the words were presented in isolation and the words were presented for 1.5 seconds. The statistical analyses of these results had a general linear model which was used in an event-related design. So they had hemodynamics, or the blood flow, which are time-locked to the stimulus onset, and this lasted for the duration of the stimulus presentation. They then had 6 separate regressors, so metaphorical sentences, literal sentences, hash mark strings, filler sentences, following questions, and fillers at the beginning of runs. And the fillers were only included to partial out their variance. And then they had to add a linear regressor to each, containing familiarity ratings to compensate for the slight difference between metaphorical sentences and literal sentences. So the results had an unexpected finding in that there was an increase in the activation in a cluster in the left medial temporal lobe, which includes the hippocampus, amygdala, and parahippocampal cortex, for the metaphorical sentences compared to the literal sentences. These regions, of course, involved in emotion, and indicates that there's more emotional activation for the metaphors compared to the literal counterparts. There's also a significant increase in the activation of primary and secondary gustatory areas, as expected, and then there were similar clusters of activation found across the temporal network that I described earlier. And then for the presentation of single words, there were no significant differences in clusters of activation between taste and non-taste words in the whole brain analysis. But then the region of interest analysis showed peaks of activation in the left frontal operculum and the lateral orbitofrontal cortex, although not in the anterior insula, which is the third part of the primary and secondary gustatory areas. So this, along with the similar activation for metaphorical sentences and literal sentences, confirmed the involvement of gustatory areas in the processing of taste metaphors. So this is just these are just the brain scans. So in A, the crosshairs showed the left frontal cluster, including the lateral orbitofrontal cortex, being activated. At B, you've got the frontal operculum, which is also part of the left frontal cluster of activation. And then here in C, you've got the activation of the left hippocampus, parahippocampal gyrus, and the amygdala, showing the emotional engagement in the metaphors. So you've got enhanced activation due to novelty, or metaphoricity, which is one of the questions in the introduction. And it's most likely due to the enhanced activation is most likely due to metaphoricity, due to the researchers controlling the variables and partitioning out the novelty variable in the original analyses. They also attempted to make all sentences familiar so they wouldn't have this novelty effect. And also, if novelty was a factor, we'd expect to see other brain areas active. So regions of executive control, such as the prefrontal cortex or the inferior frontal gyri, will be active as well when encountered with the novel stimuli. And even with conventional metaphors, such as "she is sweet," "he is," versus "she is kind," metaphorical expressions are implicitly more emotionally engaging than literal expressions. So there was actually no explicit awareness of the heightened emotional arousal by when the same sentences were given to the independent group, but clearly you can see on the scans that the heightened emotional engagement with the metaphors. So this could explain why speakers and writers use metaphors, even though literal counterparts exist. But as the previous study discussed, it's actually an important part of our everyday thinking. and so I don't think this is the only reason. Despite these conclusions, the researchers maintained an agnostic stance, in that they didn't want to conclude whether activation of emotion-related areas could be due to embodied representations of taste-related concepts or the metaphoricity. My personal interpretation is that it's very likely metaphoricity, but the following limitations may explain why they didn't want to completely commit themselves. So it's actually a very sound study, in my opinion, but the 1.5-hour experiment duration is a little bit long to be answering very boring questions, so hard to keep the participants focused, although the questions following the filler sentences was a good addition to try and counter this effect. There's also very little information provided about the independent group of participants, and again, as I mentioned before about the subjective ratings, it is subjective, and when it's just from the same population, and then the same ratings are used in more different participants, again from the same population, it kind of reduces the generalizability. Finally, the experiment was exploratory, so they didn't predict the emotional engagement for metaphorical sentences. So more research needs to be done to tightly control for emotional engagement, and this explains why they don't want to completely commit to the idea that the emotional engagement is due to the metaphoricity rather than the words being taste referential. So more research is definitely needed to determine the root cause of emotion-related activation from metaphorical sentences. It could be said that the lack of emotional activation could be due to isolated taste words not being powerful enough. So this is definitely one idea, and I think it might explain why the anterior insula wasn't activated. In the very conventional metaphors, the word sweet can be a little bit weak, but I still think it's very interesting that even those everyday metaphors activate our brain emotionally. One improvement could be using full stories rather than simple sentences, which would just increase the ecological validity. We don't normally just encounter one sentence at a time. It is normally in a much bigger context. And then are these effects that they found just limited to taste? So it would obviously be very interesting to find out what other sensory metaphors these findings are relevant to. So the empirical evidence of brain scans lends support to the ideas picked up in the original Gibbs article, that metaphors are grounded in bodily experiences. They extended on this to find that metaphors are more emotionally engaging than their literal counterparts. I tried to think of a metaphor to end this with that would feed into taste. All I could think of was to the bitter end. So yeah, thanks for listening.
Don't get too bitter, Robert. Any questions? The emotional aspect of it is pretty interesting. I know about language embodiment and so on. And so it's, to me, that the fact that you get parts of the brain activated that are associated with taste isn't surprising to me. It might be to you guys if you haven't heard that before. But some of these metaphors, they don't even come across as being sort of emotional in nature, right? And yet they invoke an emotional response. So
Definitely.
do you think it's the process of using a metaphor that does that, or do you think really it's the content of the metaphor somehow, or both, that derive that?
I think when we encounter metaphors, I think it has to be even though we don't realize it, it's still having an effect on us. In that the only way to access the meaning of the word sweet, we have to access the original meaning of sweet, which then activates the areas to do with thinking of that time when you had a really nice sweet cake at someone's birthday or something like that. So even though I think probably because we do it all the time, we don't realize that it's emotionally engaging, but I think it has to access the meaning of the metaphor. We have to go through that route and activate the original meaning of the word sweet, even though we don't realize it's a metaphor at the time.
So if you use a different word instead of sweet, that might be more neutral in terms of, because it has a positive valence,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
You can
yeah.
see maybe sticking a negative word in there, the negative valence, you maybe also get an emotional reaction, but
That would be interesting actually, something like, I don't know, crunchy or something like that, which isn't positive or negative.
right, where would that fall?
I don't know.
But again, like you said, they weren't really looking for that ahead of time, so that'll be coming.
Definitely.
Thank you.